I do want to apologize again for the class. I'm not used to doing the AM Bible study because usually an elder's doing it or some other teacher's doing it, so I kind of lost track of time. I know some people thought I had a button in my mouth instead of a rescue mitt, and so it just would never run out, and I was just going to go on forever. But I have the blessing of a wife who knows that, you know, I'm going to have trouble not making a fool of myself in public, and she does her best to keep me from it. And when I was talking at 5 after and looked over at her, she gave me a look. Now, for those of you husbands who've been married a while, you know exactly how that kind of communication works, and it works really well, because I quit. When I see that look, I'm supposed to close my mouth. And I did, and I appreciate that so much, because I was not watching the time. I will watch the time. But as I said after the class, I'm not giving you back any. Okay, I'm using the whole time here to talk. Because in fact, this is one of those difficult lessons where there is so much that can be said, and I will not be able to get it all in there. I'm going to have to force myself to slow down and enunciate my terms and words so that I don't run over myself when I begin to get excited about what this lesson is about. Because I don't think very often, sometimes, of course, we try very hard as Bible students to put things in their context. We want to see what God says, and you can't see what God says if you don't put it in its context. Too often, people take a scripture, they take it out of context, and then they make it mean something that when you put it back in has nothing to do with what the author of that context was talking about. And so I want to be sure we're leaving this in its context, but there's not just the scriptural context with which we ought to be concerned. There is a cultural context, a historical context. And one of the things that I note when this is stated, and this is, Ray read this so ably, I should have had him read about 7 of the verses, but this is really the crux of our lesson this morning. A statement that John makes at the end of his gospel. This is the disciple. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot right off the bat, because we're reading the Gospel of John going, well, yeah, duh, it's John. Why do you have to say that? There's your reason. We're going to get to that. But this is a unique statement. This is the disciple. There are 3 things that he claims as the disciple. He said, I testify of these things. Now, the first thing I want to understand is we need to go with Bible definitions of things. I mean, people talk about their testimony today, and they misunderstand terms like testimony and witness. Witness is somebody that sees something, and somebody wants to witness to you. What are they witnessing? Well, they're witnessing how they feel or what they claim happened to them, and the relevance of that has zilch to do with me and you. There's a lot of things that's happened to me that has nothing to do with you whatsoever. And when people start witnessing or they testify, and I always question the idea of testifying, because when someone testifies, they are testifying to something they have either seen, particularly in the Bible sense of the term, or of which they know. Now, if you know something and are testifying of it, then show me how you know it. Give me a book, chapter, verse. I'll be more than happy to concede that the testimony that you speak is true. When John spoke here, he's saying, I'm the disciple. I want it to be known that I'm the one who testifies of these things. Everything that he wrote, what we've been studying all year, John takes credit for it. He takes control of that. Says, I'm the one who does it. Secondly, I wrote these things. And that is one of those things. I'm not going to get too far off. We have studied that in the past here recently. The idea that God chose the written medium in order for us to understand who he is. He first spoke the words, let there be light. And then he had Moses come along and write down what he spoke so that for generations to follow, we could have the information that God reveals about who he is, about how he loves us, 2 Peter 5:9, that he cares for us. We wouldn't know that just by looking at the heavens, Psalm 19:1 and following, who declare the Maker in every sense of the word. But we know because of this written word that God and his inspired writer spoke, we know he loves us. And so John is saying, I'm the one that's testifying to these things because he was a witness. He saw everything. And I wrote these down, and here's what he follows up and concludes with. We know that his testimony is true. That's kind of an interesting phraseology there. Because normally he's talking about, he said, I'm the disciple, and I've testified. I'm the disciple, and I wrote. But we know. John includes all of those who have faith in Christ Jesus because of the things he wrote. And he covers that back in chapter 20 and talks about the signs that Jesus did and all of the things he wrote down. He wrote them down so that we could believe them. So when he does this in this verse here, he includes in verse 24 the idea that we can all know his testimony is true. We live in a culture that really struggles with the idea of knowing something, let alone truth itself, which does exist objectively. But we live in a culture that really struggles with the idea that when you say something that you know something, all of a sudden that's a controversial or conflictual kind of statement. You're looking for a fight when you say you know something, because really what you should say is I think, or I feel, or I believe, or some such things of those nature, which leaves open the idea that I could not be thinking, and maybe I didn't feel that, and I probably really don't know. But that gives opening for those who wish to take a contrary position to the one you've taken and be okay. You know, it's the old I'm okay, you're okay. You say the wall is white, I say the wall is black, but we'll just have a big group hug and get along. Christianity is not that, never has been, and that's not what John was doing here. When he wrote this down, these things that he saw, he says in 1 John, not only did we see him, we handled him. We went with him. We saw the things he did. And so when he says here, this is the disciple, what is the context culturally, historically, in which he writes this? Now, there are two schools of thought, and I don't want to get off into the details of the historical arguments one way or the other. Some believe he wrote this right around the time of Nero. Some believe he wrote it around the time of Domitian. I don't know that it really matters one way or the other, depends upon how you take some of the other writings of John. But let me tell you this, either one of these guys were sorry dogs. In fact, Nero was just off the wall, perverse, weird, cruel, hateful. The persecution he raised against the Christians, in fact, he burned a good portion of Rome down and blamed it on the Christians because he had to have a scapegoat, and then went to persecuting Christians. I don't know whether you can visualize in your mind how horrible Nero's persecution of Christians was, but just imagine for yourself walking down a street in the dark of the city in Rome at night, and the lights by which you walk are Christians hanging up and burning to death as you walk down the street. That's Nero for you. That's the kind of cruelty for which he was known. Domitian wasn't quite so bad, but almost. And Domitian had his own style of persecution somewhere around 81. And Domitian had a hard life. I mean, let's face it. His father was Vespasian. Vespasian became a Caesar in his later years. And, of course, also Domitian was the brother of Titus. And we know Titus. Titus was that great general that went in and totally decimated the Jewish nation from the ground up. Took out everything there in Jerusalem and wiped it out completely in AD 70. Very successful, very known, and bless his heart, Domitian never did have that status. And yet still became a Caesar and in charge of Rome with no experience, no history as a soldier. He was quite frivolous in the way he conducted himself, and he was one of the first of the Caesars to decide, I'm the Lord and God, and you need to reference me that way. Well, you can just imagine Christians not going along with that. And of course, what do you do with Christians when they don't, and they decide, no, we're not going to do that? And you end up sticking a guy on Patmos because he won't keep quiet about the gospel. John is writing his gospel. He writes it some while after the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He is writing an overarching view. John is, we've talked about some of this before, John is a generic gospel applicable to all walks of life, as opposed to the more specific gospels like the synoptics, where Matthew is to a Jew. Luke is very technical. As a doctor, he writes very specifically. And then we have Mark, who is very Roman-oriented and his get it done now immediately is used all throughout Mark. Here's John writing later in his life, but still not far removed from the actual events. And he's saying, I saw this stuff, and I'm writing it down, and we all know this is the truth. And what's amazing, too, is that he's writing this in his older age, when he is quite possibly, as historians tell it, the last of the apostles. was sitting, I'm sure she won't mind me using her as an example this morning in my lesson. I was sitting with Marion not too long ago, visiting about her life. Boy, she has had a life. Fascinated with some of the stories that she can tell me of her and her husband overseas in Indonesia and several other things. But she was telling me, there are not many peers around, which I can relate. She's 94. And so she's been around a minute. Most of those with whom she ran and worked with and talked to and socialized with, and the era in which she grew up, they're not there anymore. She's amazed, like I am, at the technology and what people can do, and it's hard even to understand. I mean, we got to laughing about artificial intelligence, and that's a concept some of you younger folk know what it is and can explain it really well, and I still struggle with that. I think half my smarts is artificial anyway, but that's not what it's talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence. It's just hard for someone who is in that circumstance, and when you look at John writing this letter, he is in that condition. All of the apostles have been martyred, and many of the Christians started way back in the time of Nero and scattered Christians to the four corners of the world. I mean, just everywhere. And the persecution was real. Their deaths were involved. Paul himself, that's what we call Saul, was one of them who was raising his hand and saying, yep, that person says they're a Christian, put them to death. We hear horror stories of how the Romans, and this is not just for the time of Nero or Domitian, all the way to Diocletian in 322. Christians for 300 years were persecuted and killed just because they believed in Jesus. Now it seems to come to grips with us when John says, this is the disciple. When people read this, I make no holds-barred claim that I'm the one who wrote this. There is a courage in John I think we all ought to emulate. He was not ashamed to put his signature, and that's basically what you're looking at in a gospel like this, where there isn't a deal down at the bottom saying, love and sincerely, John. We don't see that in this gospel, but that's what this is. This is a signature. This is saying, I'm John, and I'm the one who wrote this, and he's doing that almost as civil disobedience in the scope of Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where the common culture at that time was very antagonistic to Christians. And he was brave enough when he wrote this gospel in his later life to say, I'm the one who wrote it. Deal with it. There is a courage in John. I know we always speak of John as the apostle of love, and that's just as correct. I think it's interesting, though, in 1 John, in his epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, very often he makes comments about how you can know who God is and who Jesus is, and I always thought he was the apostle of knowledge. He defended the fact you can know some stuff about this. And you can know it because, as he writes in 20 and 30 and 31, verses 30 and 31, I wrote this down so you can believe who Jesus is. But I want you to know there was great courage in John's writing this gospel because in the context in which he wrote it, there was grave and great persecution. Whether you say he wrote it in the middle 60s or whether he wrote it in the middle 90s, it's irrelevant. Both those guys were horrible, horrible leaders of the Roman people, and they were both antagonistic to Christians. In both cases, John was saying, I have the courage to stand up and say, this is the truth. Now let me contrast that briefly with what we hear a lot of people talk about these days when they talk about witnessing and testifying. Because notice how convenient it is. If say, and I'm just using myself as an example, if I were to testify to you what I believe in Jesus, and what I think about the Bible, and what I think about God, and I just say, this is my testimony, and I tell you, why then you have an option of believing or not believing, and it doesn't matter. You know why? Because Jeff ain't nobody. He has no authority. What he testifies or what he believes or what he thinks has nothing to it that causes you to say, I have to believe this. It's just a cute story, what it comes down to. But that's not what John is doing here when he testifies. No, to the contrary, he's drawing a line in the sand, basically, as he signs this letter. I'm John. And he is saying, if you don't believe, you're wrong, because this is the truth. Now you see, when you and I talk to people, when we do the evangelism we should be doing, it is a far cry between the two positions, to testify or witness or tell somebody some personal thing about me and how I became a Christian, if I did at all. It's quite a different thing to do that and then tell somebody, here's what God said, and it's the truth. You know, all of a sudden, you've drawn a line in the sand. All of a sudden, now you have an honesty crisis. Am I going to look at this as a semi-intelligent person and say, yep, that is the truth, that is right, that is correct? Now I have to be honest with myself and ask the question, am I going to do this? Am I going to embrace the truth? Am I going to apply it to my life? Well, see, you don't have to do that with testimonies and witnesses that most religious people use today. You can take it or leave it. As a matter of fact, I would submit to you that the testimony and the witnesses, religiously speaking, of most people today basically have nothing to do with you or I, and you can take them or leave them whether you like them or not. It just doesn't matter. I've often wondered, and I asked a guy one time a very embarrassing question, okay, let's just assume for argument's sake your testimony, your witness is correct. What does that have to do with me? That's your personal experience. Of course, the response was, oh, you've got to have a personal experience. Well, I ask you, will mine be just like yours? Oh, no. It's individual. Which gets you into another problem, and that is the inconsistency of somebody's witness and testimony. As a matter of fact, did you know that you can go from one person to another person and get a testimony over here of what someone did to be saved, and go and find someone else who claims in their testimony and witness that they are saved, and the two will be diametrically opposed? But it's okay, because you don't have to take anybody's word for anything. It doesn't impact me personally, but that's not how the truth works, because you see, the truth is objective. And when you embrace the truth, it is either the truth or not. And Jesus said in John 8:32, you can know the truth. Well, if I can know the truth, then the real rubber meets the road issue here is me being able to say, there's the truth, I will accept it, or I will not. Now that puts you in two decidedly different categories. You see, if you see the truth, and you accept the truth, and you do what the truth says, then you can know as a fact, not as a feeling, not as a motivation that may come for a while and then leave later. You can know as a fact you have done what was right and true to become who you are. You can know the relationship you have with God because God has revealed it to you. You can know exactly what you can and cannot do. In fact, you can know the better life and anticipate with hope the heaven that is a reality by faith because of the truth. Contrast that with somebody's witness or testimony. You know, how you think you got saved, what you apparently felt in a moment. And I wouldn't deny, but somebody said, well, I felt this in my heart. Well, you may have. Okay, I'm not going to deny you might have felt something. But I can guarantee you this. That feeling will come and go because it's emotive, and it is physical, it is sentient, and those things change. Trust me, I'm looking at people out here ranging from the age of, well, little bitty to really old. And I can guarantee you this, all of us have different expressions in our life, different experiences in our life, different ways in which we have assimilated the knowledge that we have been exposed to in our life, and we are all different. And so therefore, my witness is going to be just as categorically different than yours as I am. And boy, I'm telling you, when God made me, they broke the mold. No more, please. Right? Did He make you that way? We're all individuals. Who could ever hear of the confusion of one of the most important, or the most important question that humanity ever faces? What's after I die? How do I get to heaven? Is there a clear path? Is there some accommodation for something after this life? Or is this life all we have? No, there's something more, but how do you find that? Well, somewhere along the line, there is either a truth that we can know, or there's just nothing but guesswork, and you can take it or leave it. I'm not willing, with no disrespect intended whatsoever, I'm not willing to take your word for something. I had to explain that as kindly as I possibly could to people who claim, I felt this, or I just, this feeling came over me, and then I just knew that God was loving me or doing something. I appreciate that, and I'm not even denying you may have felt something, but let me tell you this, I will not place my soul's eternity on what you felt or what you think may or may not have happened. I want the truth. When John recorded his gospel, he had the courage in his environment that we ought to imitate. Oh, sure, we can go up to people and listen to their testimony, and then we can respond, but, well, you know, I disagree a little bit. I think this, or I feel that, or you know what? That is the wrong response for a Christian. Let me just be real blunt about it, okay? Because let me tell you what. You think and you believe has no authority whatsoever. You know what has authority? God's Word, the truth. And here is an inspired apostle at risk of life saying, I'm the witness and testifying of these things. And I'm writing these things down so you guys will have something to believe in. And we all know it's the truth. You know what sets Christians apart from the entire world, besides many of the other things like how we become a Christian, how we live, and various and sundry other things? There's another thing that sets us apart, and that is the courage we have to look somebody in the eye with all the love we can muster, and the kindness and the gentleness, and tell them, you're wrong. I love you. I care about you, but you're wrong. And the reason you're wrong is not something malicious or necessarily intentionally evil. It is because you have been taught that what you feel is important, and you got to feel good. Isn't that why people choose churches? Because they make me feel good? I mean, let's think about it. Why did you choose to worship today at this congregation? Is it because it makes you feel good? Well, I hope it does make you feel good. Okay, I get that. Or is it because you like what the preacher teaches? Which I hope that's true too, but I mean, that's not a good reason. I'm sorry, it's just not. You know why you should be in this group? Because this group loves the truth. And that's what sets us apart. And so we go all the way back to Jesus' prayer, which John records in the 17th chapter. Sanctify them by thy word. Thy word is truth. What sets us apart? It's this truth, this testimony, this witness that is given by John, that is true. That's what sets us apart. And when it begins to wane, and when other things replace that metric, that guidon, that thing we look to define who we are, we become less than who we should be as God's children. We need to embrace the truth. And we need to be courageous about it. And you know, we're told if we're going to be a Christian, we're going to suffer persecution. Well, that's true. And I'll guarantee you we're not looking at the persecution that John was when he said, this is the witness of a guy who knows I am the disciple. I am the one telling you this. And this leaves a person in a place when they read it to make a decision. That's all that it does. You either have the decision to accept it and obey God, or you have the option of not accepting it and deciding, no, I'm not going to obey God. But here's the difficulty with that, and it has to do with honesty. Because we're all smart enough, well, let's put it the other way around. God is smart enough to give us a message you and I can understand. It's not beyond any of us to understand what God said. So the real issue is not in the ability to understand what we need to do. The real issue is, do you really want to love God? Because if you love me, you keep my commandments, is what Jesus said. You know, I'm not really interested. Not that it's not going to make a difference in how I feel. It does. Because when you do what's right, I mean, it's the answer of a good conscience toward God. That's stated in baptism. When you do what God says, you feel good about it. Yes. From the inside. But it's not one of those emotive, sentient feelings that just last for a little while. It goes all of your life because it's predicated, it's based on truth. And truth is there. We know the truth. And that's what will set us free, is that truth. So that's what we preach here. I hope that's what defines us as God's people, is this truth. And I hope we have the courage to let people know we love you, but there is a truth you must embrace. And no, I'm not going to leave you an easy out by just telling you some experience I have and letting you either accept it or deny it. It's no big deal. It doesn't matter. That's your personal experience. No, my personal experience don't matter. Has no authority. What has authority is that we do what God says. I would invite you, if you're not a Christian this morning, to do what God says. We always sing an invitation song. It's engineered or intended to remind you that you have a choice. And you do this morning. If you're not the Christian you should be, and you're a Christian, but you're not the Christian you should be, make a difference this morning by responding in some way to the invitation as we all stand together to sing.